There are thresholds you cross in your life without ever realizing the door has clicked shut behind you. They aren't grand, arching entryways with trumpets announcing your arrival into a new state of being. They are often disguised as the most ordinary of moments. A shared glance across a crowded room, a conversation that stretches late into the night, the quiet closing of a car door in a silent, suburban street. For me, the most significant threshold of my life arrived on a Tuesday in October, smelling of autumn leaves and Julian's specific brand of quiet panic. He had been silent for the last 10 miles, a taut line of energy humming in the passenger seat beside me, his hands clasped so tightly in his lap that his knuckles were white islands in the dim glow of the dashboard. We were parked across the street from a two-story colonial with warm, yellow lights spilling from its windows, a perfect picture of domestic tranquility that felt, in that moment, as alien and intimidating as a foreign planet. He finally turned to me, his eyes wide and dark, reflecting the sterile blue light of his phone screen, which had delivered the news of his father's sudden but not critical health scare an hour and a half ago. His voice, when it came, was a frayed whisper, a threadbare sound in the close confines of my old sedan. "Leo," he started, then stopped, swallowing hard. "Okay, this is going to sound insane." I waited. I had become an expert at waiting for Julian. My entire friendship with him felt like a long, sustained act of waiting. Waiting for him to finish a story. Waiting for him to come home from one of his endless consulting trips. Waiting for him to notice the space I had been holding for him in my life for nearly a decade. My mom, she's going to be a wreck. My dad, he'll be fine. The doctor said it's just a warning shot. But she freaks out. And she'll start in on me. About not being settled, about Sarah, about everything. It's the last thing I can handle right now. The absolute last thing. He took another shaky breath, his gaze fixed on the welcoming house, as if it were a tribunal. So, I need a shield. A deflection. Something. I still said nothing. A familiar, aching premonition began to bloom in my chest, a cold flower of dread and foolish, stubborn hope. I knew, with the kind of gut-deep certainty that comes from years of studying a person, that whatever he said next was going to dismantle me. "Just for tonight," he said, the words tumbling out in a rush, desperate and unmoored. "Just for in there. I need you to, can you just pretend? Pretend you're my boyfriend." He looked at me then, his expression a ruin of pleading and exhaustion. "It'll make it easier. They'll be so focused on that. They'll forget to worry. They'll stop asking me questions I can't answer. Please, Leo, just for tonight." And there it was. The threshold. It wasn't a door. It was a wrecking ball disguised as a key. He was asking me to perform a fiction of the single greatest truth in my life. He was asking me to build a beautiful, temporary lie on the bedrock of my most secret and sacred reality. My heart, which had been hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, seemed to stop altogether. It was a silence so profound I could hear the faint hum of the streetlights, the distant bark of a dog, the rustle of his jacket as he shifted, waiting for my answer. For 8 years, I had meticulously constructed a fortress around my feelings for him, a masterpiece of emotional architecture designed for the sole purpose of preserving our friendship. Every casual smile, every easy laugh, every platonic shoulder clap was a carefully chosen stone in that wall. And in a single, whispered request, he had handed me a stick of dynamite and asked me to light the fuse. The irony was so potent it was almost bitter, a metallic taste on my tongue. To be his boyfriend. As a favor. As a lie. It was the cruelest, most perfect kind of joke. And because I was me, and he was him, I knew, even as my world tilted on its axis, that there was only one possible answer. I nodded, a slow, single movement in the dark. "Okay, Julian," I said, my own voice sounding distant and foreign. "Okay." He sagged in his seat, the tension leaving him in a rush, a visible deflation of his shoulders. "Thank you," he breathed, the words heavy with a relief so profound it felt like a physical weight in the car. "God, Leo. Thank you." He reached over and squeezed my arm, a brief, firm pressure that sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated agony straight to my heart. He had no idea what he had just asked of me, and he had no idea that I had just agreed to walk through fire for him, simply because he had asked me to. We sat there for another minute, suspended in the strange new gravity of our agreement, the warm yellow house waiting. I was no longer just Leo, his photographer friend, his roommate, his anchor. For tonight, I was a fiction. I was a shield. I was his boyfriend. And I had the terrifying feeling that this performance would be the most honest acting I would ever do. Our story, the real one, hadn't begun with a crisis. It had begun with the mundane poetry of college housing assignments. I was a quiet, lanky arts student obsessed with light and shadow, my world contained within the viewfinder of my grandfather's old Minolta. He was Julian, a force of nature disguised as a business major, all bright smiles, easy confidence, and a gravitational pull that seemed to effortlessly draw people into his orbit. We were placed in a shoebox-sized dorm room in our freshman year, a pairing so unlikely it felt like a clerical error. My side of the room was a controlled sanctuary of neatly stacked photo books, developing chemicals that smelled faintly of vinegar, and black and white prints tacked to the wall. His side was a beautiful, chaotic storm of soccer jerseys, crumpled notes from girls, and textbooks he seemed to absorb through osmosis rather than actual study. For the first few months, we were just bodies sharing a space, orbiting each other with a polite, cautious distance. I found his relentless energy exhausting. He likely found my quiet intensity bewildering. I was a creature of observation, most comfortable on the periphery, documenting the world from a safe distance. Julian lived squarely in the center of it all, a bright, kinetic subject practically begging to be captured. And I did capture him, though he never knew it. I had rolls of film filled with him. Julian, mid-laugh, head thrown back, a constellation of freckles across his nose. Julian, asleep at his desk, a pen still clutched in his hand, the harsh desk lamp carving dramatic shadows across his face. Julian, staring out the window on a rainy afternoon, a rare moment of stillness that felt like a secret I was privileged to witness. He was, from the very beginning, the most compelling subject I had ever found. The friendship, when it finally took root, did so in the dead of winter, during a week of brutal final exams. I was hunched over my desk, trying to edit a series of photos for my portfolio, my eyes burning from exhaustion. Julian, who had breezed through his own finals with an infuriating lack of apparent effort, came in around 2 in the morning, smelling of cold air and cheap beer. He stopped behind me, peering over my shoulder at the contact sheets. I tensed, expecting a joke, a dismissal. My work was intensely personal, and I guarded it fiercely. Instead, he was quiet for a long time. "Wow," he said, his voice low and surprisingly serious. "You make the world look quiet, like it's holding its breath." I didn't know how to respond. It was the most astute observation anyone had ever made about my photography. He hadn't commented on the technical aspects, the focus, or the composition. He had understood the feeling. He had seen the intent. That one, he pointed to a stark image of a lone, leafless tree against a flat gray sky. "It feels lonely, but not sad. Just alone. Like it's okay with it." He saw me. In that single moment, looking at a picture of a tree, he saw the core of who I was. The quiet observer, the solitary soul who found a strange peace in being on the outside looking in. After that, something shifted between us. The polite distance dissolved, replaced by a genuine, easy camaraderie. He would ask to see my latest photos, listening with rapt attention as I explained my process. I would find myself drawn out of my shell, laughing at his ridiculous stories about his soccer teammates or his disastrous attempts at cooking. We were an odd pair, the sun and the satellite, but we worked. Our friendship became a fixed point, a constant in the chaotic churn of college and the uncertain years that followed. After graduation, when the prospect of finding separate, affordable apartments in the city seemed daunting, sharing a place felt like the most natural thing in the world. We found a 2-bedroom apartment in a slightly worn-out building with good light, which was my only real requirement. He took a job as a software consultant that had him traveling 3 weeks out of every month, and I began the slow, arduous process of building a freelance career as a photographer. My feelings for him, which had been a low, persistent hum throughout college, deepened in the quiet spaces of that apartment. It was a secret I kept locked away in the most secure vault of my heart. It was a dull, constant ache, a background radiation to my daily life. I watched him date a string of bright, beautiful women, attending their holiday parties as Julian's friend Leo, smiling and making small talk while my insides twisted into complicated knots. I was his confidant, the one he came to when a relationship ended, the one who listened and offered quiet, steady support. I played my part so well that I sometimes even convinced myself it was all I wanted. The friendship was too precious, too vital. It was the central pillar of my life, and the thought of risking it for a love that was almost certainly unrequited was a terror I couldn't face. So I stayed quiet. I observed. I waited. And I loved him from a safe, unbreachable distance, capturing his life in stolen moments and silent photographs, a historian of a love that only I knew existed. The shift began subtly, a change in the emotional weather that I was uniquely attuned to. It started with Sarah. She was different from the others. Where his previous girlfriends had been bright, fleeting comets, Sarah was a planet, solid and steady. They were together for nearly 2 years, a record for Julian. She was a landscape architect, smart and kind and grounded, and for a while, I saw a version of Julian I hadn't seen before, one that seemed settled, content. I practiced being happy for him, repeating it to myself like a mantra until it felt almost true. I learned to navigate the new geometry of our friendship, the triangle we had become. I was still his best friend, but there was a new center to his universe. I told myself it was for the best. It created a necessary boundary, reinforcing the walls of my own self-preservation. Then, the travel for his job intensified. A big international project had him flying to London or Singapore for weeks at a time. The video calls with Sarah became strained, the time differences a chasm between them. Julian, who thrived on kinetic energy and human connection, began to look frayed around the edges. He would come home utterly depleted, a ghost haunting our apartment for a few days before packing up and leaving again. He and Sarah started fighting, their arguments hushed but sharp, leaking through the thin walls of our apartment like a toxic gas. He wanted her to understand. She wanted him to be present. They were speaking different languages, their needs completely misaligned. The breakup, when it came, wasn't a dramatic explosion but a quiet, sad implosion. He came home one Tuesday night after a 3-week trip, dropped his suitcase by the door, and walked into the living room where I was editing photos. He didn't say anything, just sank onto the couch and stared at the opposite wall. I knew instantly. The air in the room was heavy with it. She ended it, he said finally, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Said she felt like she was dating a ghost. Said she couldn't do it anymore. I didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances. I just sat with him in the silence, a silent acknowledgement of his pain. This wasn't like the other breakups, the ones he'd bounce back from in a week with a new story and a new girl's number. This one had broken something in him. The easy, confident charm that had always been his armor was gone, leaving behind someone I barely recognized, someone quiet, hollowed out, and profoundly lonely. That night, something fundamental in our dynamic cracked. He wasn't the vibrant sun and I the orbiting satellite anymore. He was a star that had collapsed in on itself, and for the first time, he was the one being pulled into my quiet, steady orbit. He didn't want to be alone. He started canceling his weekend plans, opting instead to stay in, claiming exhaustion. We would order takeout and watch old movies, a comfortable routine from our college days, but now it was freighted with a new, unspoken need. He was seeking refuge in my presence, and I, despite the treacherous hope it ignited in me, became his sanctuary. The ritual began on a Thursday night about a month after the breakup. We were on the couch, watching some mindless action movie. A comfortable silence settled between us. Julian had been quiet all day, lost in a fog of what I could only assume was grief and exhaustion. Midway through the film, I glanced over and saw that he had fallen asleep, his head lolling against the back of the couch at an awkward angle. This wasn't unusual, but what happened next was, his head slipped, and with a soft sigh, came to rest on my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. I held my breath, every nerve ending firing at once. He was so close I could feel the warmth of him through my shirt, smell the faint, clean scent of his shampoo. My heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, a statue carved from pure tension, terrified that if I moved, if I even breathed, the spell would break. He just slept, his breathing deep and even, a picture of absolute trust. After the movie ended, I didn't have the heart to wake him. I gently shifted, trying to ease out from under him, but he mumbled something incoherent and his hand shot out, loosely grabbing the front of my sweatshirt. It was a reflexive, unconscious gesture, but it rooted me to the spot. I stayed there for another hour, my shoulder aching, every muscle screaming, until he finally stirred on his own, blinking in the dim light of the television screen. He pulled away, scrubbing a hand over his face. "Sorry," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Must have been more tired than I thought." He said nothing about grabbing my shirt. I said nothing at all. That was the first thread. In the weeks that followed, more threads were woven, creating a new, complicated tapestry between us. The couch sleeping became a regular occurrence. But then it escalated. One night, he came out of his room, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. "It's freezing in my room," he said, shivering for effect, though I knew our apartment's heating was notoriously even. "Mind if I crash out here?" He didn't wait for an answer, just curled up on the far end of the sectional, a safe distance away. But the barrier had been breached. He was no longer retreating to his own space at the end of the night. He was choosing to stay in the shared one. The most significant ritual, the one that became the central text of my obsessive internal analysis, was the door. For as long as we had lived together, Julian's bedroom door was always closed at night. It was an unspoken boundary, a symbol of our separate lives under the same roof. About 2 months after the breakup, I noticed it was ajar. Just a crack, a sliver of darkness that was different from the solid wood I was used to seeing. I stood in the hallway for a full minute, staring at that sliver, my mind racing. Was it an accident? A new carelessness born of his exhaustion? Or was it something else? The next night, the crack was wider. The night after that, the door was left halfway open. It was an invitation. It was a question hanging in the silent air of our apartment. My own door, which had always been open, now felt like a response. Our hallway had become a silent conversation. Then came the night that changed everything. A storm was raging outside, wind and rain lashing against the windows. The power had been flickering all evening. We were both on edge. Around midnight, I was in bed, reading, when my own door creaked open. Julian stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim light of the hall. He looked like a frightened kid. "Hey," he whispered. "The wind. It's really loud." It was a flimsy excuse, and we both knew it. He hadn't been afraid of thunderstorms since he was 8 years old, a fact I knew from a story his mother had once told me. "Can I?" He gestured vaguely toward the empty side of my queen-sized bed. "My room feels, I don't know, big." My throat was dry. This was it. The culmination of all the small gestures, the open door, the lingering touches. This was a deliberate step across a clearly marked line. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed at me to say no, to protect the fragile peace I had so carefully curated. But the sight of him standing there, looking so lost and vulnerable, overrode everything. "Sure," I heard myself say, the word barely a whisper. He slipped into the room, closing the door softly behind him, and slid into the bed. The space between us felt like a mile-wide canyon charged with 1,000,000,000 volts of electricity. We lay on our backs, staring at the ceiling, not touching. The only sounds were the storm outside and the frantic drumming of my own heart. I was hyper-aware of everything. The dip in the mattress from his weight, the subtle shift of air as he breathed, the sheer, overwhelming fact of his physical presence in my bed, in my most private space. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, two statues in the dark. Then, slowly, deliberately, he rolled onto his side, facing me. I didn't move. I kept my eyes fixed on the ceiling, pretending to be asleep, my body rigid with a mixture of terror and unbearable hope. And then I felt it. The weight of his arm, draping carefully over my waist. It wasn't a casual, sleepy gesture. It was intentional. His fingers rested lightly on my hip, a brand of warmth that seemed to seep directly into my bones. He pulled himself slightly closer, until his chest was flush against my back, and he tucked his face into the space between my shoulder blades. He let out a long, slow breath, a sound of such profound contentment and relief that it shattered the last of my defenses. This was not plausible deniability. This was not an accident. This was a choice. And as I lay there, pinned by the weight of his arm and the even heavier weight of my own love, I knew that the old rules no longer applied. A new ritual had begun, one that was both a terrifying torment and the sweetest kind of heaven I had ever known. The nightly ritual became our new, unspoken normal. It was a silent agreement that took hold of our lives with a quiet, inexorable force. It no longer required a thunderstorm or a flimsy excuse about a cold room. After we finished watching a movie or talking in the living room, he would simply follow me to my bedroom. He would close the door behind us, a soft click that sealed us into our own private world, and we would get into bed. The pretense of separation was gone, replaced by this shared space, this shared silence. The first few nights were a study in exquisite tension. We would lie stiffly, a careful foot of space between us, both acutely aware of the line we had crossed. But his need for comfort, for proximity, was a tide that always pulled him closer. Inevitably, in the deep of the night, I would feel the shift in the mattress, the warmth of his body as he rolled towards me, the now familiar weight of his arms settling around my waist. He always initiated it. I remained passive, a willing but silent participant, terrified that any move on my part would shatter the fragile, beautiful thing we were building. I became a connoisseur of his closeness. I learned the cartography of his sleeping form, the way his fingers would sometimes twitch in a dream, the soft, huffing sound he made right before he fell deeply asleep, the way his hair felt against my cheek when he burrowed his face into my neck. My nights became a series of long, sleepless vigils, where I would lie awake for hours, cataloging every sensation, drowning in the sheer, overwhelming proximity of him. It was a sweet agony. My body was thrumming with a desire I had suppressed for years, while my heart ached with a love that felt both requited and utterly unspoken. During the day, we orbited each other in a strange new dance. There was an unspoken tenderness, a new softness to our interactions. He would watch me work, a small, thoughtful smile on his face. He started cooking for me, simple meals that were nonetheless imbued with a level of care he had never shown before. We talked for hours, about everything and nothing, my photography, his frustrations with work, our shared memories from college. We were closer than we had ever been, emotionally and physically, and yet, the central truth remained unsaid. We never spoke of what happened when the lights went out. We never acknowledged the fact that we were, for all intents and purposes, sharing a bed like a couple. The ambiguity was a protective bubble, but it was also a source of constant, low-grade anxiety for me. I was living in a dream, and I was terrified of waking up. I was developing a photograph in my mind, watching the image of us slowly emerge in the chemical bath of our shared intimacy. But I was terrified that when the lights came on, the image would be blank, a figment of my own desperate imagination. The first crack in that bubble came on a quiet Sunday night. We had spent the day in a comfortable, domestic rhythm, a late breakfast, a long walk in the park where I took photos of the changing leaves, an afternoon spent reading on opposite ends of the couch. The intimacy was so easy, so natural, it felt like we had been doing this for years. That night, in bed, the usual ritual unfolded. We lay in the dark, the silence thick with unspoken things. He rolled over, his arm coming to rest around me, pulling me close. But this time was different. Instead of falling asleep, he remained awake. I could feel the tension in him, a thrum of nervous energy that mirrored my own. His thumb began to trace small, idle circles on my hip, a conscious, deliberate touch that sent shivers through my entire body. It wasn't the mindless comfort of a sleeping man. It was a question. "Leo," he whispered, his voice so low I almost thought I'd imagined it. "Yeah." I managed my own voice tight. He was silent for a long moment. I could feel his breath on the back of my neck. "Don't go," he said finally, the words a soft plea. It was such a simple phrase, but it landed with the force of a physical blow. Go where? I wasn't going anywhere. I hadn't been going anywhere for years. But I understood what he meant. He wasn't talking about leaving the bed. He was talking about leaving him. He was asking me to stay in this strange, undefined space with him. He was acknowledging, for the first time, that my presence was not just a comfort, but a necessity. And then he did something that shattered the last vestiges of plausible deniability. He took my hand. He didn't just grab it. He carefully, deliberately, laced his fingers through mine. Our palms pressed together, a perfect fit. It was an anchor in the swirling chaos of my emotions. It was a confession. It was the most definitive, nonverbal declaration I could have ever imagined. My mind, which was usually a cacophony of analysis and doubt, went completely silent. There was no room for interpretation. There was only the solid, irrefutable fact of his hand in mine, his body pressed against my back, his quiet plea hanging in the air between us. I squeezed his hand, a single, firm pressure. It was my answer. I'm not going anywhere. He squeezed back, and in that shared pressure, in that silent, tactile conversation, a new foundation was laid. The photograph was no longer hazy. It was coming into sharp, terrifying focus. He didn't fall asleep for a long time after that. Neither did I. We just lay there, holding hands in the dark, the world outside our bedroom, door fading away until there was nothing left but the two of us. The morning after was cold. Not just in the air, but between us. I woke up alone, the space beside me empty and cool to the touch. The warmth, the connection, the certainty of the night before felt like a dream. I found Julian in the kitchen, already dressed, pouring coffee into a travel mug. He wouldn't meet my eyes. The easy intimacy of the past weeks had vanished, replaced by a brittle, awkward silence. The air was thick with the things we weren't saying. "I've got an early meeting," he said, his voice clipped. "Gotta run." "Julian," I started, but he was already moving, grabbing his laptop bag, heading for the door. "We'll talk later," he threw over his shoulder, a promise that felt empty. And then he was gone. I stood in the silent kitchen, the smell of his coffee hanging in the air, a ghost of his presence. The hope that had bloomed so brightly in my chest overnight wilted, leaving a familiar, bitter ache. I had let myself believe. I had misinterpreted the signals. The hand-holding, the whispered "don't go." It had been a moment of weakness for him, a product of loneliness and confusion that he now regretted in the harsh light of day. I felt like a fool, a profound, naive fool. That evening, when he came home, the distance was still there, a palpable wall between us. He was polite, distant, retreating into his phone, his laptop, anything to avoid looking at me. That night, for the first time in weeks, his bedroom door was closed. A solid, definitive barrier. It was a rejection more potent than any words could have been. The silence from his side of the apartment was a roaring in my ears. I lay in my own bed, in the vast, empty space he had occupied for so long, and I felt a loneliness so sharp and so deep it was like a physical wound. The comfort of our ritual had been a lie, and the truth was this cold, empty bed. I couldn't live like this, in this limbo of unspoken rejection. The ambiguity had been tolerable when it was hopeful. This new ambiguity, the one that felt like pity and regret, was unbearable. The next evening, I cornered him. He was putting away groceries, his movements jerky and avoidant. I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, blocking his escape. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He sighed, a long, weary sound, and finally stopped, leaning his hands on the counter, his back to me. "Leo, I'm really tired." "No," I said, stepping into the room. "No more of that. Look at me, Julian." He turned around slowly, his face a mask of exhaustion and conflict. His eyes, which I knew as well as my own, were full of a miserable confusion that almost broke my resolve. "What happened?" I asked, my voice softer now. "The other night, and now this. The door is closed again. You're barely looking at me. Just tell me what's going on." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure frustration. "I don't know," he said, his voice cracking. "Okay, I don't know. I'm a mess, Leo. My life is a complete mess. Sarah, my job. I feel like I'm just drifting. And you're not. You're solid. You're the only solid thing in my life right now." He looked at me then, and the vulnerability in his gaze was gut-wrenching. "When I'm with you, especially at night, it's the only time my brain shuts up. It's the only time I feel safe." He shook his head, looking away again. "But it's not fair to you. I'm using you as a crutch." That night, holding your hand, it felt like something I don't understand. And it scared me. "It's not you, Leo. It's me. I'm confused." His words were a strange mixture of comfort and pain. He wasn't rejecting me, not exactly. He was rejecting his own feelings, feelings he couldn't name or comprehend. He was scared. The knowledge didn't erase the hurt, but it changed its texture. My pain was no longer just about my own unrequited love. It was now tangled up with his fear and confusion. He saw me as a sanctuary, but he was afraid of what that meant. He had pulled away not because he felt nothing, but because he had felt something. We were left in a stalemate, a tense, fragile truce. The closed door remained a symbol of his fear, a boundary he had re-erected out of panic. And I was left on the other side, waiting once again, but this time, the waiting was different. It was no longer a passive state. It was charged with the knowledge that there was something on his side of the door worth waiting for, if only he could find the courage to open it again. It was in this state of suspended animation, this delicate and painful quiet, that his mother called. And so we sat in my car, the engine off, the silence humming with the weight of his insane, desperate request. Just for tonight, pretend you're my boyfriend. He was offering me the role of a lifetime. A part one had been rehearsing in the privacy of my own heart for 8 years. The context was all wrong, a cruel twist of fate, but the role itself, it fit like a second skin. My agreement, a quiet, okay, had settled between us, and now we were faced with the reality of the curtain rising. Right, he said, taking a deep, fortifying breath. Okay, the plan. We've been seeing each other for a few months. Since just after Sarah. It's new, so we're taking it slow. He was talking fast, constructing the narrative, building the set for our little play. You're a photographer. That's easy, it's true. They'll love that. My mom loves artists. He glanced at me, a flicker of his old, charming self in his eyes. Just be you. The quiet, thoughtful you. They'll see why someone would fall for you. That last part hit me like a stray punch. They'll see why someone would fall for you. Was he talking about himself? Was it a slip of the tongue, or a deliberate breadcrumb dropped for me to follow? My mind, the relentless analyst, kicked into overdrive, but I forced it to be quiet. I couldn't afford to get lost in interpretation now. I had a part to play. Okay, I said again, my voice low and calm, projecting a confidence I did not feel. A few months. Taking it slow. I can do that. I reached for the door handle. Let's go see your dad. As we got out of the car, he reached for my hand. His fingers were cold, but his grip was firm, desperate. It was nothing like the tentative, questioning touch in the dark of my bedroom. This was a public act, a claiming. As we walked up the stone path to the front door, bathed in its warm, welcoming light, I felt a strange sense of unreality, as if I were watching a movie of my own life. This felt both completely fraudulent and more real than anything I had ever experienced. The moment the door opened, the performance began. Julian's mother, a woman with his same warm eyes and a face etched with worry, pulled him into a fierce hug. Her eyes immediately darted to me, then down to our joined hands. A flicker of surprise, then curiosity. "Mom," Julian said, his voice steadier than it had been in the car. "This is Leo." We drove down as soon as we heard. He paused, squeezing my hand. "Mom, he's my partner." He didn't use the word boyfriend, he used partner, a word that felt heavier, more permanent. A word that sent a fresh shockwave through my system. Julian's mother, Helen, blinked once, her worry-creased face softening into a gentle, surprised smile. "Oh," she said, her voice warm. "Well, it is so good to meet you, Leo. Any partner of Julian's is family here. Please, come in, come in." We stepped inside, into a house that smelled of cinnamon and old books. The performance was surprisingly easy, because Julian was leading the dance. He didn't let go of my hand. He kept me anchored to his side, introducing me to his father, who was sitting in a recliner, looking pale but otherwise fine. With a simple, "Dad, this is Leo," he rested his free hand on the small of my back, a gesture of casual, possessive intimacy that felt both breathtakingly bold and completely natural. He was a better actor than I had anticipated. Or maybe, a terrifying thought began to bloom. Maybe it wasn't acting at all. We spent the next few hours in the warm cocoon of his family's living room. I answered his parents' questions about my photography, about how we'd gotten together. I spun a modified version of the truth, telling them we'd been friends for years and that things had just shifted recently. Julian would chime in, adding details, looking at me with an expression of such open affection that it made my heart ache. He wasn't just playing a part for his parents. He was playing it for me, too. He was showing me a version of himself, of us, that I had only ever dared to dream about. The most surreal moment came when his mother pulled me aside into the kitchen under the pretext of helping with tea. She leaned against the counter, studying my face with a kind, perceptive gaze. "I have to admit, I was surprised," she said softly. "Julian has never brought a boy home before. But you know," she paused, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "I haven't seen him this calm in years. Since the traveling started, he's been like a tightly wound string. But with you, he seems grounded. He keeps looking at you like you're north on a compass. You're good for him, Leo." I was speechless. She saw it. She saw the effect we had on each other, even through the artifice of our lie. "He's good for me, too," I managed to say, and it was the most honest thing I had said all night. Later, as things were winding down, Helen announced, "Well, the guest room is all made up for you two. I hope one bed is all right." The air crackled. The lie had now created a practical, unavoidable consequence. We were being sent, with his parents' blessing, to share a bed. Julian just nodded, a calm, "That's perfect, Mom. Thank you." That betrayed none of the internal chaos I was sure he had to be feeling, because I was certainly feeling it. The line between the performance and reality had completely dissolved. We were heading upstairs to continue this play in the one place where, for weeks, we had been living a secret, fragile truth. The tension was unbearable. The guest room was cozy, decorated in soft blues and creams, with a single, large queen bed covered in a thick quilt. The door clicked shut behind us, and suddenly, the performance was over. We were alone again, just Leo and Julian, the weight of the night pressing in on us. The silence was deafening. All the words we had said downstairs, all the casual touches and affectionate glances, they all hung in the air between us, demanding to be acknowledged. He wouldn't look at me. He walked over to the window and stared out at the dark, quiet street, his shoulders tense. I didn't know what to do. Should I break the silence? Should I pretend to be tired and just get into bed, retreating to the familiar script of our unspoken ritual? The uncertainty was a physical thing, a tightness in my chest. I decided to wait. This was his story to navigate. He had written the first scene, and he had to write this one, too. After a long, agonizing minute, he spoke, his voice low and strained, still facing the window. It wasn't all an act. For me, my breath caught in my throat. There it was. The admission. The crack in his carefully constructed confusion. I took a step closer. "I know," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He turned around then, his face a landscape of raw, unguarded emotion. The confident mask was gone. The confused, scared friend was gone. In his place was someone I had never seen before, someone utterly vulnerable and open. "Seeing you with them," he said, his voice thick. "Talking to my mom, making my dad laugh, it all just clicked. It wasn't a lie to make things easier. It was the truth. It's the one thing that isn't a mess. It's you." He took a hesitant step towards me, closing half the distance between us. We were standing in the middle of the room, close enough to feel the heat radiating from each other, the air thick with 8 years of unspoken history and a few hours of breathtaking pretense. "Leo," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, his eyes searching mine. "All those nights, in your bed, I wasn't just hiding. I was coming home. I was just too scared to knock on the door." The door metaphor. He had understood the silent conversation of our hallway all along. The realization hit me with a quiet, profound force. "I'm not scared anymore," he whispered, taking the final step that brought our bodies almost flush. He raised a hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and gently cupped my jaw. His thumb stroked my cheek, a feather-light touch that undid me completely. My carefully constructed walls, the fortress I had spent years building, crumbled into dust. "Would it be okay?" he asked, his voice cracking with the weight of the question, his gaze locked on mine. "If I kissed you?" It was the gentlest of permissions, the most profound of questions. He wasn't taking, he was asking. He was giving me the power, the choice, the final say. All the years of waiting, of aching, of hoping, they all coalesced into a single, breathless moment. I couldn't speak. I just nodded. A tear I hadn't realized was forming, finally escaping and tracing a path down my cheek. He leaned in slowly, giving me every opportunity to pull away, and pressed his lips to mine. It wasn't a passionate, desperate kiss. It was quiet. It was tentative. It was a question and an answer all at once. It tasted of salt from my tear and a sweetness that was purely Julian. It was a kiss of homecoming. It was the soft, certain click of a door finally locking behind me, not shutting me out, but sealing me in. Safe. The drive home the next day was a stark contrast to the tense, silent journey to his parents' house. The autumn sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, and for the first time in a long time, the silence between us was not heavy with unspoken things, but light with a newfound peace. We held hands over the center console, our fingers intertwined, a simple, public fact that still sent a thrill of disbelief through me. After about an hour of quiet driving, he finally spoke, his voice soft. "I owe you an apology," he said, not looking at me, his eyes on the road. "For the past few weeks. For pulling away. For closing the door. You were scared," I said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. "Terrified," he admitted with a wry, self-deprecating laugh. I felt like I was losing my mind. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about what I wanted, it was all just falling apart. And in the middle of all that chaos, there was you. This quiet, constant, steady presence. And the feelings I started having, they didn't fit into any box I had for myself. It was easier to pretend they weren't there than to face what they meant. He turned to look at me then, his expression serious and open. It meant I was falling in love with my best friend. And I didn't know how to do that without breaking the best thing I've ever had. "You wouldn't have broken it," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I've been on the other side of that door the whole time, Julian. Just waiting for you." A sad smile touched his lips. "I know that now. I think a part of me always knew. I was just afraid to trust it. Last night, seeing you there, in my home, with my family, it was like seeing in color for the first time. It wasn't a performance. It was a preview. It was what my life could be like. And for the first time, I wasn't scared of the future. I wanted it." We talked for the rest of the drive. Really talked. We unraveled the tangled knots of the past few months, laying all the unspoken fears and misinterpreted signals out in the open. He talked about his loneliness on the road, the slow erosion of his relationship with Sarah, the feeling of being unmoored. I talked about the years of quiet affection, the pain of watching him with other people, the sweet torture of our nightly ritual. It was a conversation that was years overdue, a catharsis that left us both feeling lighter, clearer. We were erasing the lie of the night before and replacing it with a foundation of hard-won truth. When we got back to our apartment, the space felt different. It was no longer a place of separate orbits and unspoken tensions. It was just home. He dropped his bag by the door and walked over to his bedroom, placing his hand on the closed door. He looked at it for a moment, then looked back at me, a small, meaningful smile on his face. He pushed it open, wide, and then walked past it into my room. He sat on the edge of my bed, the bed where so much had happened in silence, and patted the space beside him. I followed him in, my heart full. The geography of our apartment had been redrawn. His room, my room, they were no longer separate territories. They were just rooms in our shared home. The door was no longer a symbol of his fear or my longing. It was just a door. Its power was gone, replaced by a simple, quiet certainty. The days that followed were a gentle unfolding. We were learning a new language together, one spoken not in grand declarations, but in small, domestic intimacies. It was in the way he'd bring me a cup of coffee in the morning without asking, just the way I liked it. It was in the way I'd rest my hand on his back as I passed behind him in the kitchen. It was in the quiet evenings spent on the couch, my head in his lap as he read, his fingers idly tracing patterns in my hair. The desperate, needy closeness of the ritual was gone, replaced by an easy, constant proximity. We were a fact, no longer a question. One afternoon, about a week later, I was setting up my equipment for a shoot. The light was perfect, streaming through the living room window, soft and golden. Julian was on the couch, reading, a peaceful, unguarded expression on his face. For years, I had only taken stolen photos of him, candid shots from a distance, my lens a barrier that kept me safe. Now, I saw him clearly, without the filter of my own yearning and uncertainty. "Hey," I said softly. He looked up, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Don't move." I raised my camera, my old Minolta, the one that had documented our entire history. I focused the lens. For the first time, he didn't look away or strike a self-conscious pose. He just looked at me, his gaze direct and full of a quiet, steady love. I saw him not as a secret subject, not as an object of my affection, but as my partner. The focus was sharp. The composition was perfect. The light was beautiful. I pressed the shutter. The click was a soft, satisfying sound in the quiet room. It felt like a conclusion and a beginning. There are thresholds that arrive disguised as ordinary moments, and there are truths that arrive disguised as lies. The story we told his parents was a fiction, but it was the catalyst for the most profound truth of our lives. It was the absurd, terrifying performance that finally gave us permission to be real. Lying in bed that night, not as a ritual of comfort, but as a deliberate choice, my back pressed against his chest, his arms securely around me, his breathing a slow, steady rhythm against my skin, I thought about the strange, winding path that had led us here. We had built a home, not in the apartment, but in the quiet, honest space we had finally learned to create between us. The door to my room was closed, sealing us in, and for the first time, it felt less like a barrier against the world and more like the beginning of our own.